Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and lovers of history, there are few stories from the Second World War that combine the grandeur of human engineering, the pride of nations, and the devastating lesson of hubris quite like the story of Yamato, the mighty battleship of the Imperial Japanese Navy. When Japan launched Yamato in 1941, she was the embodiment of naval supremacy. Towering over the seas, armored like a floating fortress and armed with 9 colossal 18.1-inch guns, the largest ever mounted on a warship, Yamato represented Japan's unshakable belief that no enemy could challenge her power. The admirals who oversaw her construction believed they had built something beyond destruction, a vessel that could single-handedly change the tide of war. They called her Unsinkable. But history, as it so often does, had a different verdict. By April 1945, the war in the Pacific had turned against Japan. The United States had seized the Marianas, captured Iwo Jima, and was closing in on Okinawa. The Japanese Navy, once proud and mighty, was now a shadow of its former self, low on fuel, aircraft, and hope. Yet, in one final act of defiance, Japan decided to send Yamato on a mission that could only end in death. Operation 10 Go, it was called. The plan was suicidal from the start. Yamato, along with a handful of escort ships, would sail south to Okinawa and attack the American fleet supporting the invasion. The ship had only enough fuel for a one-way trip. The crew knew that they would not be coming back. But the Admiralty believed that if Yamato could beach herself and serve as a stationary fortress, she might at least inflict symbolic damage, an echo of Japan's warrior spirit. Even in defeat, when Yamato left port on April 6, 1945, more than 3,000 sailors stood on her decks. They were young, loyal, and filled with a grim resolve. Some carried personal letters folded in their uniforms. Others whispered quiet prayers to the sea. Above them towered their ship, the pride of Japan, the largest battleship ever to sail. But waiting for her was not another battleship. Waiting for her was the future. On the morning of April 7th, American reconnaissance aircraft spotted Yamato, and then the storm came, not of wind and rain but of steel and fire. Over 300 US planes, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters launched wave after wave of attacks from the sky. The ocean churned with explosions as bombs and torpedoes tore into the great ship's armor. The Japanese gunners fought back fiercely. Anti-aircraft fire lit up the skies, and for a few moments, Yamato seemed to fight like a living beast. But sheer power and courage could not overcome numbers and precision. The US Navy had mastered the art of air warfare, and battleships, those symbols of the old world, were no match for it. One torpedo struck Yamato's port side, then another, then another. Her engine shuddered, her decks erupted in flames, and the ship began to list. Inside, sailors struggled to control flooding compartments, to save their ship, to defy fate itself. But the sea was relentless. Within hours, the pride of Japan had become a burning wreck. And then, as if in slow motion, Yamato capsized, her magazines detonated, and she vanished beneath the waves in a massive explosion that sent a column of smoke rising 6 kilometers into the sky. The shockwave could be felt for miles. Over 3,000 men went down with her. Only around 280 survived. The Unsinkable had sunk. What sank Yamato was not just American firepower. It was the death of an era, the era of the battleship, the era of old strategies, and perhaps most tragically, the era of blind pride. The Japanese admirals had refused to see the world changing around them. They believed armor could defeat air power. They believed courage could overcome technology. And in doing so, they sent thousands of brave men to their deaths. But the story of Yamato is not merely a tale of destruction. It is a timeless reminder. It reminds us that no matter how mighty our creations, how proud our achievements, or how confident our assumptions, arrogance is always the first step toward downfall. The admirals of Japan believed they had built a symbol of invincibility. Instead, they built a monument to human overconfidence. Yet, even amid that tragedy, there was honor. The sailors of Yamato did not go down in despair. They went down serving their nation, believing they were protecting their homeland. History may judge the decisions of their leaders, but it cannot deny the courage of those men who faced certain death with unwavering resolve. Today, Yamato rests 1,000 feet below the East China Sea, silent, broken, and entombed in darkness. But her story continues to echo across generations. Every rusted gun and shattered hull plate tells us something profound, that power without wisdom is a fleeting illusion. For the United States, the sinking of Yamato symbolized not just victory, but the dawn of a new age, the age of air dominance and technological warfare. For Japan, it marked the closing chapter of its naval pride, and perhaps the humbling realization that no weapon, no matter how mighty, can stand against the relentless march of innovation. And for the world, it was a moment of awakening. The end of Yamato was not just the end of a ship, it was the end of an idea. So, when we look back at that April morning in 1945, we should not see only the flames or the sinking hull. We should see the lesson that rose from the sea, the lesson that even the greatest giants fall when they fail to adapt, when they fail to listen, when they mistake pride for strength. In every age, nations and leaders face the same temptation, to believe that what they have built cannot be challenged, that their power is beyond reach. Yamato teaches us that nothing, and no one, is beyond the reach of change. The ocean that swallowed Yamato is the same ocean that reflects our own humanity, our brilliance, our ambition, our arrogance, and our ultimate fragility. The admirals once boasted that Yamato was unsinkable, But as 300 American planes sent her to the bottom, the world learned an eternal truth: pride may build empires, but humility preserves them. Thank you. When the Imperial Japanese Navy began planning the construction of Yamato, it was not merely designing a battleship, it was crafting a statement of national power, pride, and destiny. The 1930s were an era when Japan saw itself as rising to challenge the Western powers that had long dominated the Pacific. Its leaders viewed the ocean not as a barrier, but as a vast field of opportunity, and in their minds, no instrument could better project that vision than the most powerful warship ever built. The decision to construct Yamato was born from both strategic necessity and emotional conviction. Japan's naval planners understood that they could never match the industrial might of the United States ship for ship. America could outproduce them in cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft carriers. Therefore, Japan's solution was to build fewer ships but make each one so overwhelmingly powerful that it could defeat multiple American opponents in direct combat. It was an audacious idea, wrapped in the dream of quality overcoming quantity. The Yamato was to be the manifestation of that belief, a single battleship capable of taking on an entire fleet. From the beginning, secrecy surrounded the project. Its blueprints were classified at the highest level, and even many within Japan's own military structure knew little about it. The ship was constructed in the core naval arsenal under an enormous cover, a massive wooden canopy built to hide her size from reconnaissance planes. Engineers worked tirelessly to realize a design that pushed the limits of naval architecture. Displacing nearly 72,000 tons at full load, Yamato would be the largest battleship ever built. Her main guns, 9 18.1-inch monsters, could fire shells weighing over 3,000 pounds, capable of penetrating any existing armor at ranges exceeding 25 miles. Her armor belt was so thick that it seemed impenetrable. Her decks were layered with steel meant to shrug off even the most powerful bombs. The very philosophy behind her construction was defensive invincibility paired with offensive terror. When Yamato was launched on December 16, 1941, only 8 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, it seemed as though Japan had truly achieved something divine. She represented not only a new kind of ship but a national symbol of technological mastery. Her presence was meant to instill confidence in the Japanese people and dread in the hearts of Japan's enemies. To the admirals who oversaw her creation, she was proof that Japan could stand equal, or superior, to any Western nation. She was both a weapon and a message. The Empire of the Rising Sun had reached its zenith. Inside Japan, the myth of Yamato quickly grew. She was named after the ancient name for Japan itself, Yamato, signifying not just power, but cultural essence and imperial destiny. Her name alone carried spiritual weight, tying the modern industrial marvel to Japan's mythic past. Newspapers spoke of her in awe, though the government carefully avoided revealing too much detail. To the public, she was a symbol of invulnerability, the iron heart of a nation destined for victory. That belief extended to the highest levels of military command. Admirals saw Yamato not as just a ship but as the embodiment of Bushido, the samurai spirit reborn in steel. She represented honor, sacrifice, and the unyielding will of Japan's naval tradition. Yet behind that gleaming image, cracks were already forming, both in the philosophy that created Yamato and in the world she was meant to dominate. By the time she entered service, the era of the battleship was already fading. The Battle of Taranto in 1940 and the devastating success of carrier-based aircraft at Pearl Harbor had proven that air power could render even the mightiest ships vulnerable. While Japan itself demonstrated this truth when its aircraft destroyed American battleships at anchor, its own admirals remained deeply attached to the doctrine of surface warfare. They saw Yamato as the ultimate expression of traditional naval might, dismissing the idea that fragile airplanes could ever replace the majesty and endurance of a battleship. In a sense, Yamato was a paradox. She was both a technological masterpiece and a relic the moment she was completed. Her creators had poured into her the best materials, the most advanced engineering, and the boldest imagination their nation could muster. But they had built her for a kind of war that was already passing into history. Even so, within Japan's military circles, faith in her invulnerability remained absolute. During trials, she performed magnificently. Her armor withstood all tests. Her massive guns fired with thunderous precision. The admirals watched her glide across the water with a sense of divine satisfaction, as though they had conquered the very limits of human craftsmanship. Her first commander, Captain Miyazato, wrote that standing upon her bridge felt like standing atop a mountain. The world seemed small from there, and that view reflected Japan's own mindset at the time. They saw themselves as masters of the Pacific, destined to shape history by their will and bravery. In the ship's design, there was more than military logic, there was national psychology. Yamato was Japan's answer to its inferiority complex against Western powers, a steel embodiment of their belief that courage and craftsmanship could overcome industrial disparity. It was not merely a weapon but a cultural statement. Japan would not bow, would not yield, and would not be surpassed. The ship's internal design was equally grand. Inside her hull were massive living quarters, state-of-the-art command systems, and an array of secondary weapons. She carried an entire floating city of sailors, engineers, gunners, and officers. For the men who served aboard her, Yamato was more than an assignment. It was an honor beyond words. They polished her decks with reverence and treated her as a sacred vessel. To many, she was an extension of Japan itself, a microcosm of their homeland floating in steel upon the sea. The daily routines aboard her reflected both military discipline and cultural devotion. Rituals were performed before major operations and Shinto ceremonies were held to bless her voyages. The ship, the crew, and the empire were bound together by a shared illusion of immortality. However, as the war dragged on, the grand symbol of power spent most of its existence doing very little. Yamato was too valuable to risk. Japan's naval commanders, while proud of her, were also terrified of losing her. For years, she remained largely in port or used as a reserve force, her massive guns firing few shots in anger. This inaction became a symbol of Japan's strategic paralysis. The ship that was supposed to dominate the oceans instead became a burden, an asset too precious to deploy. Meanwhile, the tide of war shifted rapidly. America's industrial strength and technological adaptability overwhelmed Japan's static strategies. While American shipyards produced carriers and destroyers by the dozens, Japan struggled to even fuel its fleet. The irony was painful. Yamato had been built on the premise that Japan could never match America's quantity, yet her very existence drained resources that might have been better spent elsewhere. Her construction had consumed vast amounts of steel, manpower, and time. Every ton of metal that went into her hull was a ton not used for aircraft, submarines, or escort vessels. By the time she was finally called upon to fight, she was a symbol of magnificent futility, a giant designed for a world that no longer existed. Still, the myth persisted. In the hearts of Japanese sailors and citizens alike, Yamato remained untouchable. Propaganda films and wartime speeches invoked her name as a reassurance that Japan's spirit remained unbroken. When defeats mounted and islands fell, the image of Yamato gliding proudly through the seas offered psychological refuge. She was proof that Japan's craftsmanship and courage still mattered, even when reality was turning grim. Admirals continued to boast of her invulnerability, convinced that her sheer presence would one day turn the tide. What those admirals could not see, or refused to see, was that Yamato represented not progress, but denial. She was the physical embodiment of a nation clinging to the past, unable to accept that innovation and adaptation had replaced brute strength as the true measure of power. Her massive guns, once symbols of dominance, were now impractical in the face of aircraft that could strike from beyond her reach. Her heavy armor, once a source of pride, made her slow and vulnerable to torpedoes and bombs. Every feature that had made her magnificent also made her obsolete. Yet, despite this, there is something deeply human about the creation of Yamato. It shows how pride and hope can drive people to create wonders, even in the face of inevitable failure. The engineers who designed her believed they were building perfection. The workers who hammered her plates together did so with nationalistic devotion. The officers who commanded her believed that if any ship could change fate, it was this one. In their hearts, Yamato was not doomed, it was destined. As the years went by, the world came to see Yamato not only as a warship but as a metaphor. She symbolized Japan's rise, its ambition, its blindness, and ultimately its tragedy. When historians look back at her construction, they see more than steel and rivets. They see the psychology of a nation that tried to turn pride into armor. The ship's story begins not with battle, but with belief, the belief that something made by human hands could be perfect, indestructible, and eternal. And like all such beliefs, it was destined to be tested. In the end, Yamato's creation was both a triumph and a warning. It demonstrated what a nation could achieve through unity, discipline, and vision, but also how easily those same virtues could be consumed by pride. The ship that was built to secure Japan's glory became the vessel that would later carry its tragedy. Every bolt and beam reflected a dream too large for reality to sustain. Yamato was not just a battleship, it was Japan itself, magnificent and flawed, determined and doomed. By April 1945, the Empire of Japan was standing on the brink of collapse. The once dominant imperial navy had been shattered by years of relentless warfare. Its aircraft carriers lay at the bottom of the sea, its air wings were decimated, and its fuel reserves were nearly exhausted. The empire that had once swept triumphantly across the Pacific now faced encirclement. The Allies were closing in, and the invasion of Okinawa, just 340 miles from the Japanese mainland, marked the final stage before the home islands themselves would be attacked. The Japanese military leadership knew the end was near, yet they were bound by a code that refused surrender. In this atmosphere of desperation and fatal pride was born one of the most tragic and symbolic missions of the entire war, Operation 10, Go, the final voyage of Yamato. Yamato was no longer a secret weapon by 1945. The Americans knew of her existence and power through intercepted communications and aerial reconnaissance. Yet she had done little to justify her myth. For years she had remained anchored, her massive guns silent, while the war's tide turned against Japan. But as the Allies advanced toward Okinawa, Japanese admirals sought one last display of strength, something to rally the spirit of the nation and show that Japan's warrior ethos remained unbroken. The idea for Operation 10 Go emerged not from strategic logic, but from emotional desperation. It was conceived less as a military plan and more as an act of symbolic sacrifice, a final offering of honor to the emperor and the nation. The plan in its brutal simplicity was this: Yamato, escorted by a handful of smaller vessels, would sail from Japan to Okinawa, where she would fight to the death against the American invasion fleet. Since Japan had virtually no air cover left, the ship's commanders knew that Yamato would almost certainly be destroyed long before reaching the island. She carried only enough fuel for a one-way journey. Once she reached Okinawa, she was to beach herself and serve as a stationary fortress, firing her massive guns until destroyed. Every man aboard knew that he would not return. It was a mission of certain death. When the order was issued, there was a brief silence among the officers. Some were stunned, others quietly accepted it as fate. Admiral Syuchi It, who commanded the operation, initially resisted the idea. He argued that sending Yamato without air support was meaningless, a waste of men and material. But Japan's naval leadership, driven by a mixture of pride and fatalism, overruled his objections. They insisted that it was better to die gloriously than to sit idle while the empire crumbled. The Yamato would sail as a symbol of Japan's undying resolve. To refuse was to dishonor the very ideals the ship represented. In the end, Admiral It bowed to his duty. On April 6, 1945, Yamato prepared for her final voyage. In the early hours, the ship's crew assembled on deck. Many had tears in their eyes, others stood silently, their faces pale but resolute. Before departure, a Shinto ceremony was held. Priests blessed the ship and her men, and messages of loyalty were read aloud. Some sailors wrote farewell letters to their families. Others took photographs together, smiling faintly as if to hide the fear that pressed upon their hearts. The youngest among them were barely 19 years old. When the anchor was raised, Yamato's massive engines rumbled to life, and the great ship glided slowly out of Tokuyama harbor, her gray hull gleaming under the morning sun. Accompanying her were one light cruiser Yohoji and 8 destroyers, small and vulnerable compared to the behemoth they guarded. The mission had begun. The men aboard Yamato knew the truth. Their destination was death, but not a meaningless one in their eyes. Japanese wartime propaganda had long glorified self-sacrifice as the ultimate virtue. Dying for the emperor and the nation was considered the highest honor a man could achieve. To the sailors, the thought that they were part of a final, heroic gesture gave them a grim kind of pride. They were the living embodiment of the Yamato Demashi, the spirit of Japan. As the ship cut through the waves, its bow cleaving the dark sea, there was an air of eerie calm. The sky was clear, the ocean vast, and the men went about their duties with quiet precision. Some sang softly, others wrote their last thoughts in diaries that would never be read. But the Americans were ready. Allied codebreakers had long since deciphered Japan's communications, and the departure of Yamato was detected almost immediately. U.S. reconnaissance planes tracked her progress as she moved southward, and the American command prepared a devastating reception. They would not allow Yamato to reach Okinawa. Instead of engaging her with ships, they would send an armada of aircraft, hundreds of planes from multiple carrier groups, to destroy her from the sky. On the morning of April 7, Yamato was about 200 miles north of Okinawa when she was spotted by a U.S. scout plane. The news raced through the American fleet, enemy battleship sighted. Within hours, the largest aerial strike in naval history up to that point was launched. More than 300 planes, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters roared into the sky. The mission was to annihilate the pride of the Imperial Navy. At 2:30 p.m., the first American aircraft appeared on Yamato's radar. The ship's sirens wailed as sailors ran to battle stations. The calm of the voyage was shattered by the shriek of alarms and the clatter of anti-aircraft guns being loaded. As the enemy planes descended, the sky erupted into chaos. Bombs and torpedoes rained down and the sea around Yamato boiled with explosions. The ship's anti-aircraft gunners fought furiously, filling the sky with flak. Many U.S. planes were hit, some spiraling into the sea, but there were simply too many attackers. The first wave of torpedoes struck Yamato's port side, tearing open her armor and flooding her lower decks. The great ship shuddered violently but continued forward, her gunners still firing defiantly. Then came another wave and another. Torpedoes smashed into her hull, bombs crashed onto her deck, and fires spread across her superstructure. The smoke was so thick that men could barely breathe. The ship began to list heavily to port. Inside, engineers and damage control teams struggled desperately to counterflood compartments and keep her upright. The order came to reverse engines, but the damage was too great. Power failed in several sections, communication lines went dead, and the giant vessel slowed almost to a stop. Admiral It remained calm on the bridge, even as the situation grew hopeless. Officers begged him to abandon ship, but he refused. All hands fight to the end, he ordered. Below decks, men continued to load shells into the big guns, though they had no clear target. Others fought the fires with buckets of water, coughing and choking in the smoke. Some wrote quick prayers on scraps of paper and tucked them into their clothing. As the list increased, the ship's decks became slippery with oil and blood. Dozens were thrown overboard by explosions. The escort ships around Yamato were also being torn apart. The light cruiser Yahagi was hit repeatedly and soon sank, taking most of her crew with her. By 2:00 p.m., Yamato was mortally wounded. At least a dozen torpedoes and 8 heavy bombs had struck her. Water poured into her hull faster than any pump could handle. The order to abandon ship was finally given, though it came too late for most. Sailors scrambled over the sides, jumping into the burning sea as explosions rippled through the ship. Some were dragged down by the suction of the sinking vessel, others were consumed by flames or killed by secondary blasts. At 1:23 p.m., one of Yamato's forward magazines detonated. The explosion was so enormous that it split the ship in two, sending a mushroom cloud of smoke towering nearly 20,000 feet into the air. The shockwave rolled across the ocean like thunder. and then, within minutes, the pride of Japan was gone, swallowed by the sea. Out of a crew of over 3,000 men, only about 280 survived. Most of those were pulled from the oily waters by the few destroyers that managed to escape. They watched as the waves closed over the spot where Yamato had vanished, taking with her the hopes and illusions of an entire generation. Admiral It went down with his ship, along with most of his officers. His last recorded words were calm and stoic: "We have done our duty. Operation Tengo was over. The mission had achieved nothing militarily. It had not reached Okinawa, had not damaged the enemy, and had not altered the course of the war." Yet in Japan, it was remembered not as a failure but as a tragic act of nobility. Newspapers and radio broadcasts hailed Yamato's final voyage as the ultimate expression of Japanese courage. The government portrayed it as a glorious sacrifice for the emperor, a proof that the spirit of the nation remained unbroken even in defeat. But for those who understood the reality, it was a catastrophe born of arrogance and desperation. It was the inevitable result of leaders who could not face the truth that their empire was lost. The story of Operation Tengo is one of the most haunting in military history because it encapsulates the collision between honor and futility. The men who sailed on Yamato were brave beyond question, but their bravery was wasted in service of a doomed cause. Their deaths accomplished nothing except to add another tragic chapter to the long list of wartime sacrifices made in vain. In their courage, there was beauty. In their fate, there was tragedy. The ocean that swallowed them also swallowed the last dream of the Imperial Navy. When historians look back at that final voyage, they see more than a naval engagement. They see the symbolic end of Japan's imperial ambition. Yamato's sinking marked the death of the belief that courage and tradition could triumph over technology and reason. The greatest battleship ever built had gone to sea without air cover, without fuel for return, and without hope of success. She was sacrificed not for victory, but for pride. Operation Tengo stands as a solemn reminder that sometimes nations choose glory over survival, and in doing so, they find both lost beneath the same waves. The story of Yamato's destruction is not just the story of a single ship's demise, it is the story of a profound transformation in the art of war. For centuries, naval supremacy had been measured in tons of armor, inches of gun caliber, and the number of battleships that a nation could float. The battleship was the ultimate symbol of power, a fortress at sea, a nation's pride made manifest in steel. Yet, by the time Yamato sailed into battle for the last time, the world had already moved into a new era. The age of the battleship was ending, and the age of air power had begun. The clash between Yamato and the US carrier planes was more than a military engagement. It was the dramatic moment when one era of warfare yielded to another. In the early 20th century, naval warfare revolved entirely around the battleship. The launching of HMS Dreadnought in 1906 revolutionized naval architecture and triggered an arms race among the world's powers. Every major nation sought to build bigger, faster, and more heavily armed ships. Japan, eager to secure its place among the great powers, joined the race with unmatched fervor. Battleships were not merely tools of war, they were instruments of prestige. To possess the largest and most powerful fleet was to command respect on the world stage. This belief dominated naval thinking for decades, and it shaped the philosophy that produced Yamato. Japan's naval doctrine before World War II centered on what it called the decisive battle strategy. The idea was simple but deeply ingrained. When war inevitably came with the United States, Japan would lure the American fleet across the Pacific, wear it down with submarines and small surface attacks, and finally destroy it in one climactic battle between capital ships. This concept was inspired by the victory at Tsushima in 1905, when the Imperial Japanese Navy annihilated the Russian fleet in a single decisive encounter. Japan's admirals believed history would repeat itself. They saw the battleship as the key to that triumph, the weapon that would decide the fate of nations in a single day. But while Japan clung to that doctrine, the world was changing. The airplane, once dismissed as a fragile novelty, was becoming a weapon of astonishing potential. The interwar years saw the development of carrier aviation, and navies began experimenting with how to project air power at sea. The United States and Britain invested heavily in aircraft carriers and naval aviation training, while Japan itself developed some of the world's best carrier pilots and aircraft in the 1930s. Ironically, it was Japan's own stunning success at Pearl Harbor in 1941 that proved the supremacy of air power over battleships. In a single morning, carrier-based aircraft from 6 Japanese carriers crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet, sinking or disabling 8 American battleships without a single ship-to-ship engagement. The lesson should have been clear even then: the future of naval warfare belonged to the sky. Yet Japan's high command did not fully accept what that meant. They saw Pearl Harbor not as a vindication of carrier power, but as a temporary advantage. Their strategic heart remained loyal to the battleship, the visible, tangible embodiment of might. Yamato and her sister ship, Musashi, were designed under that lingering faith. They were conceived as unstoppable juggernauts that could crush any opponent in direct combat. What the admirals failed to grasp was that the very battlefield on which they expected to fight had changed. As the war progressed, American strategy evolved rapidly. The U.S. Navy embraced the aircraft carrier not as a support vessel but as the centerpiece of its naval power. The Fast Carrier Task Force concept transformed how fleets operated: mobility, range, and air dominance replaced armor and gun range as the decisive factors. Carriers could strike hundreds of miles away, long before an enemy battleship could even bring its guns to bear. Planes became the new artillery shells, faster, more flexible, and infinitely more devastating. The results were decisive. At the Battle of Midway in 1942, Japan lost 4 of its front-line carriers and most of its best pilots in a single engagement. The loss crippled its ability to wage offensive war. Yet even after that disaster, Japanese strategists continued to believe that their battleships could still play a vital role. Yamato and Musashi were seen as the last hope for turning the tide. But the American carriers, now growing in number and sophistication, dominated the Pacific. Each engagement reinforced the reality that ships without air cover were helpless targets. When Musashi, Yamato's sister ship, met her fate in 1944 during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, it was already clear that the battleship era was ending. She was attacked by nearly 300 American planes and sunk after receiving more than 20 torpedo and bomb hits. Her immense armor and guns availed her nothing. The same fate awaited Yamato a few months later. In both cases, the mightiest warships in the world were destroyed by aircraft, machines smaller than one of their gun barrels but infinitely more versatile. The sinking of Yamato by 300 U.S. planes on April 7, 1945 was the final undeniable proof of the new order. No fleet of battleships could have withstood what Yamato faced that day. The air attacks were relentless, precise, and coordinated. Dive bombers crippled her communications and fire control systems, torpedo bombers targeted her weak points with ruthless efficiency, and fighters strafed her decks, suppressing anti-aircraft fire. Every advantage that Yamato's designers had painstakingly built into her, the thickness of her armor, the range of her guns, the discipline of her crew, was rendered useless by an enemy she could not reach. Her main guns, capable of hurling shells over 25 miles, could not even target the aircraft that attacked her from above. She was a weapon built for a world that no longer existed. The contrast between Yamato's massive power and her helplessness that day was symbolic of the transformation in global warfare. It was not merely a technological change but a philosophical one. The battleship represented human control, visible power, and the belief that strength lay in direct confrontation. Air power, by contrast, was elusive, impersonal, and abstract. It represented distance, speed, and the dominance of strategy over spectacle. The airplane had turned the ocean from a surface battlefield into a three-dimensional arena. It was no longer about who could build the biggest gun, but who could strike first and from the farthest distance. This shift had profound implications beyond naval combat. It marked the beginning of the modern era of warfare, where technology and innovation began to outweigh tradition and heroism. For Japan, which built its military doctrine on notions of bravery, sacrifice, and the samurai spirit, this was a devastating realization. The courage of Yamato's crew could not overcome the technological superiority of the American fleet. Their valor was real, but valor alone could not stop bombs falling from the clouds. The war had moved from the realm of individual courage to that of industrial and scientific mastery. The United States had mastered the art of coordinated air-sea operations. By combining radar reconnaissance and carrier-based squadrons, they could locate and destroy enemy fleets before they ever came within gun range. Battleships became obsolete not because they lacked power, but because they lacked reach. The most expensive and heavily armed ships in the world were now vulnerable to aircraft that cost a fraction of their price. It was a revolution in efficiency, an inversion of the old logic that size and cost equaled strength. Even as Yamato sank beneath the waves, the lessons of her destruction were already shaping the post-war world. The age of air power did not end with World War II, it expanded. Nations realized that control of the skies meant control of the battlefield. The carrier replaced the battleship as the centerpiece of naval might, and air forces became the decisive arm of every major power. The legacy of Yamato was thus both tragic and transformative. Her death marked the birth of the modern military age. Yet, for all its strategic clarity, the transition was emotionally painful. The battleship had been more than a machine. It was a symbol of human pride, craftsmanship, and courage. Watching it rendered obsolete by fragile aircraft felt, to many, like watching the end of an era of heroism. The men who had spent their lives mastering the art of naval gunnery and command were left behind by a generation that mastered engines, wings, and radio waves. The thunder of big guns gave way to the roar of propellers and, later, the scream of jet engines. In Japan, the loss of Yamato was mourned not just as a military defeat but as a cultural one. The battleship had embodied the ideals of endurance, discipline, and loyalty, the very essence of the nation's spirit. Its sinking was not only the fall of a ship but the symbolic death of those ideals in the face of a changing world. The American pilots who destroyed her were not samurai. They were professionals, guided by radar and mathematics, representing a new kind of warrior, the technician soldier. The age of glory had been replaced by the age of calculation. Still, there was an undeniable beauty in the transformation. The shift from battleship to air power reflected humanity's relentless drive to innovate, to adapt, to overcome the limits of old thinking. It was the story of progress written in smoke and steel. The aircraft carrier became the new capital ship, a floating airfield capable of projecting force across oceans. Battleships would linger for a few more years, but their days of dominance were over. When Yamato sank, she took with her not just her crew and her guns, but the very idea that might could be measured in armor and caliber. In the decades that followed, even as nations built jet aircraft and nuclear submarines, the shadow of that transformation remained. The lesson of Yamato, that technology and adaptability triumph over size and tradition, became a guiding principle of modern warfare. It was not simply that air power had defeated sea power, it was that innovation had defeated complacency. The sky had become the new ocean, and the airplane the new battleship. When historians reflect on the Pacific War, the image of Yamato engulfed in flames beneath the assault of American planes stands as one of its defining moments. It captures in a single scene the collapse of the old world and the rise of the new. The greatest battleship ever built was destroyed not by an equal opponent, but by weapons from above, small, fast, and agile. It was the ultimate demonstration that the future belongs not to those who boast of strength, but to those who embrace change. And so, the clash between air power and battleship power was not merely a battle for control of the Pacific, it was a battle for the soul of warfare itself. The skies won, and with them, the course of history was forever altered. When we examine the tragedy of the Yamato, we are compelled to look beyond steel, guns, and aircraft, and into the realm of human decision-making, the fatal flaw that often brings down empire's arrogance. The story of Yamato is not merely about the destruction of a ship, it is a tale of pride clouding judgment, of leaders who mistook prestige for power, and of a nation so caught in the myth of its invincibility that it ignored the changing tides of war. The sinking of Yamato was, in many ways, not an unavoidable catastrophe but a predictable outcome of arrogance disguised as courage, of honor misinterpreted as strategy. The seeds of this hubris were planted long before Yamato ever touched the water. Japan's Imperial Navy, shaped by the victory at Tsushima in 1905, grew up believing it was destined for greatness. The stunning defeat of the Russian fleet at Tsushima gave Japan an intoxicating sense of superiority, a belief that courage, discipline, and sheer willpower could overcome even the most formidable enemies. That victory, though remarkable, created a dangerous illusion that persisted for decades, the illusion that Japan's spirit and traditions made it unconquerable. By the time World War II erupted, that belief had hardened into dogma. Japan's military leaders saw themselves as heirs to a divine mission. They spoke of Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan, a code of loyalty and sacrifice that they believed could triumph over material odds. When they commissioned Yamato in 1937, they did not merely build a warship, they built a floating shrine to their own ideology. Every decision about the ship's design reflected this mindset. She was to be the biggest, the strongest, the most impregnable battleship the world had ever seen. Her main guns were the largest ever mounted on a warship, and her armor was so thick that no known shell could penetrate it. Japanese admirals convinced themselves that by sheer size and craftsmanship, Yamato could dominate any battlefield. But while Japan poured its limited industrial resources into a handful of colossal ships, the United States invested in aircraft carriers, radar, and logistics, the technologies that would define the new age. Japanese leadership, however, refused to recognize this shift. Even after the devastating success of the Pearl Harbor attack, when carrier planes had proven their supremacy, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, though personally a believer in air power, was still pressured by traditionalists who worshipped the battleship. These men could not accept that the vessel they had glorified for decades had become obsolete. The arrogance of the Imperial Navy was institutional. Senior officers came from an elite, insulated caste who valued appearance and honor over innovation and practicality. Dissent was discouraged, questioning authority was seen as weakness. Young officers who proposed new doctrines or questioned outdated tactics were often ignored or silenced. This rigid hierarchy steeped in the samurai ethos left little room for flexibility. Thus, even as Japan's fleet was being destroyed by air power in battle after battle, from Midway to late Gulf, many admirals continued to believe that their super battleships could restore Japan's lost glory. By 1945, Japan was already facing inevitable defeat. Its cities lay in ruins, its economy was shattered, and its navy had been largely annihilated. Yet, even in the face of these realities, pride refused to yield to pragmatism. When the Yamato was ordered to make her final sortie in April 1945, Operation 10 Go, it was not a strategic decision but a symbolic one. The ship was to sail to Okinawa, fight until her ammunition was spent, and then beach herself to become an unsinkable gun platform. In essence, it was a suicide mission. There was no air cover, no hope of success, and no rational justification. It was an act born of desperation and arrogance, a gesture meant to preserve honor rather than achieve victory. Admiral Tsuchi It, who commanded Yamato on her final voyage, initially opposed the mission. He knew it was futile. He understood that without air support, Yamato would be an easy target for American planes. Yet under pressure from Tokyo, he relented. The leaders of the Imperial Navy insisted that Yamato must die gloriously, a sacrifice that would inspire the nation. It was a decision soaked in fatalism and pride, the kind of decision that mistakes symbolism for strategy. The same leaders who had once boasted that Yamato was unsinkable were now sending her to certain destruction, clinging to the illusion that death in battle was preferable to surrender. This mindset, where pride overrules reason, was not unique to Japan, but it was particularly destructive in this context. The belief that honor demanded sacrifice blinded Japan's military leadership to the realities of modern warfare. They saw the act of fighting itself as more important than the outcome of the fight. They believed that even defeat, if honorable, would somehow preserve the nation's dignity. But dignity does not rebuild cities or feed starving civilians. Pride does not win wars, it destroys those who serve it. The American commanders, in contrast, approach warfare with cold pragmatism. They had learned through bitter experience that adaptability, not pride, wins battles. The US Navy was guided by data, intelligence, and strategic flexibility. When Yamato was detected leaving the inland sea, American reconnaissance planes tracked her movements in real time. The decision to attack was made swiftly and efficiently. There was no drama, no speeches about honor, just calculation and execution. The contrast between the two sides could not have been sharper, one driven by emotion and ideology, the other by logic and precision. As Yamato sailed south, her officers and crew knew they were going to die. Many of them reportedly wrote farewell letters to their families before departure. Some carried small shrines or photographs of loved ones. On board, there was an eerie calm, a grim acceptance that this was the end. To them, dying aboard Yamato was not a tragedy but a duty. They had been taught from birth that death for the emperor was the highest calling. The leadership's arrogance had instilled in them a fatal sense of loyalty, one that glorified death over survival. When the attack came, wave after wave of American aircraft raining bombs and torpedoes. There was no miracle, no heroic turnaround. Yamato's anti-aircraft guns fired desperately, but it was hopeless. The ship that had been called Unsinkable was torn apart in less than 2 hours. Her magazine exploded with a force so great that it was seen 100 miles away. Over 3,000 men perished, only about 270 survived. It was the single greatest loss of life aboard any warship in history. And for what? No strategic objective was achieved, no victory was gained, no difference was made in the outcome of the war. It was a meaningless sacrifice. The ultimate expression of hubris turned to ashes. The Japanese high command, upon hearing of Yamato's destruction, offered the usual rhetoric of honor and bravery. But beneath the ceremonial words, there must have been the sting of realization their pride had doomed their greatest creation. They had sent thousands of men to die for an illusion, the illusion of invincibility. The same arrogance that had built Yamato had also destroyed her. In a broader sense, Yamato's fate mirrored that of Japan itself during World War II. The nation's leadership was consumed by delusions of grandeur. They believed they could stand against the industrial and technological might of the United States, a nation with resources beyond anything Japan could match. Instead of recognizing their limitations and seeking a diplomatic end to the conflict, they doubled down on pride and ideology. They believed that Japan's divine destiny would compensate for material disadvantage. This belief led to the ruin of cities, the suffering of civilians, and the deaths of millions. The arrogance of leaders who refused to admit failure prolonged the agony of an entire nation. Leadership failure often comes not from ignorance but from the refusal to learn. The Japanese admirals were not unintelligent. They were trapped in their own myth. They clung to a vision of warfare that had already passed into history. They mistook past glory for present capability. The lessons of Pearl Harbor, Midway, and late Gulf were before them, yet they refused to adapt. Their minds were armored as heavily as their ships, resistant to change, impervious to reason. And so Yamato became both a monument and a tomb, a monument to human ambition, and a tomb for those destroyed by it. Her story stands as a timeless reminder of what happens when leadership becomes inflexible, when arrogance replaces analysis, and when pride blinds nations to reality. Great powers fall not only because of enemies, but because of their own illusions. The admirals who boasted that Yamato was unsinkable were not defeated by superior guns, but by superior minds, by leaders who understood that progress cannot be stopped by pride. The cost of arrogance is always greater than its defenders believe. For Japan, that cost was the loss of an empire, the devastation of its homeland, and the deaths of millions of its people. For Yamato, it was the transformation from symbol of glory to symbol of futility. The world watched as the mightiest ship ever built was consumed by flames, a spectacle both terrible and instructive. Her destruction taught a lesson that echoes far beyond her time in war. As in life, arrogance is not strength. It is the prelude to defeat. The legacy of the Yamato is far more profound than the story of its destruction. Though the battleship lies beneath the waves of the East China Sea, its spirit endures as one of the most powerful symbols of war, technology, and human ambition. The name Yamato itself carries meaning that transcends steel and fire. It was an ancient name for Japan, evoking the nation's cultural heart and soul. When the ship was built, it represented more than military might. It embodied national identity, pride, and hope. Yet as history unfolded, Yamato came to symbolize something very different: the consequences of misplaced faith in strength, the tragic cost of arrogance, and the inevitability of change. Its legacy remains a haunting echo in the annals of human history, a reminder that even the mightiest creations of humankind can become tombstones for their own creators' dreams. When Yamato was conceived in the late 1930s, Japan stood at the crossroads of ambition and insecurity. The world was witnessing rapid industrial growth, technological revolutions, and rising tensions among great powers. Japan, eager to assert itself as an equal to the Western empires, viewed the building of Yamato as an assertion of sovereignty and technological mastery. The ship was meant to send a message that Japan could not only match the naval power of the West but surpass it. Every rivet, every plate of armor, every turret was a declaration of national pride. To the Japanese people, Yamato became a living symbol of their nation's greatness. It represented resilience, unity, and divine purpose. Propaganda elevated the ship to near mythical status. Posters, newspapers, and films celebrated her as the protector of the empire and the unsinkable guardian of the emperor. For a time, the myth seemed to work. Even as Japan faced growing setbacks in the Pacific, Yamato remained a beacon of hope, a belief that the empire still possessed an invincible weapon that could change the course of the war. But as with all myths built on illusion, the truth eventually surfaced. The Yamato's destruction exposed not only the vulnerability of the ship, but also the fragility of the ideology it represented. When she went down, taking with her over 3,000 men, it was not merely the loss of a vessel, it was the collapse of a national dream. The Yamato's sinking was a moment of collective reckoning for Japan, one that stripped away the illusions of invincibility and forced a nation to confront the reality of modern warfare and its own limitations. Yet, paradoxically, in her death Yamato achieved a different kind of immortality. She became not just a relic of defeat but a symbol of endurance. In post-war Japan, the story of Yamato transformed from one of pride and loss to one of reflection and identity. It came to represent the tragedy of war itself, the waste of human potential and the futility of blind nationalism. Her legacy began to evolve into a cautionary tale, a mirror through which generations could examine the cost of arrogance and the necessity of peace. For many Japanese citizens, the memory of Yamato became intertwined with the nation's post-war journey. The ship's fate paralleled Japan's own transformation, from militaristic empire to pacifist nation, from conqueror to contributor, from destroyer to rebuilder. The ruins of the ship, lying silently beneath the sea, became a metaphor for rebirth. Out of the ashes of war, Japan rebuilt itself not with battleships and guns but with innovation, diplomacy, and perseverance. The lessons of Yamato became the lessons of modern Japan. That strength is not measured by armor, but by wisdom, that the power to destroy is far less valuable than the power to create. In a broader historical context, Yamato's legacy extends beyond Japan. For military historians and strategists, it marks a turning point, the end of the battleship era and the dawn of modern warfare dominated by air and later, nuclear power. The Yamato and her destruction demonstrated a simple, eternal truth: no weapon, however mighty, is immune to obsolescence. The obsession with building the biggest, or the strongest, can blind nations to the realities of innovation and change. It was a lesson not only for Japan but for every power on Earth. The same principle applies even today, in an age of drones, missiles, and artificial intelligence, technologies that evolve faster than doctrines can adapt. The fate of Yamato serves as a warning to those who mistake size for superiority and tradition for progress. But there is another, more human side to Yamato's legacy, one that speaks not of technology or strategy but of people. The men who served aboard her were not symbols, they were sons, fathers, brothers, and friends. Many were barely out of their teens, drawn from all corners of Japan, filled with the same pride and fear that accompany young soldiers in every war. They believed they were serving a noble cause. The fact that so many of them perished in vain underscores the tragedy of war's human dimension. The waste of life in service of political and ideological delusion. Today, memorials to Yamato honor not the machinery of war, but the humanity of those who died. Their sacrifice reminds us that every ship, every tank, every weapon is ultimately manned by human beings whose lives are far more precious than the instruments of destruction they command. In the decades following the war, Yamato became an object of fascination for writers, filmmakers, and scholars. Books and documentaries explored her design, her missions, and her destruction in meticulous detail. Yet beyond the technical discussions, there was a deeper yearning, a desire to understand how something so magnificent could end in such futility. This fascination speaks to a universal human theme, the allure of greatness and the inevitability of downfall. In the Yamato, people saw a reflection of themselves, the ambition to reach for glory and the pain of confronting failure. In 1980, the film Yamato brought the story to a new generation, portraying not just the might of the ship but the humanity of its crew. Later, the animated series Space Battleship Yamato reimagined the vessel as a futuristic ark that saves humanity, turning tragedy into hope. These cultural reinterpretations show how the Yamato's story evolved over time, from a wartime symbol of dominance to a post-war emblem of peace and redemption. The ship that once represented imperial ambition was reborn in popular imagination as a vessel of salvation, carrying the message that humanity must learn from its mistakes and strive toward a future free of destruction. In that sense, Yamato's legacy is dual. It warns and inspires. It warns against the perils of unchecked pride, the blindness of leadership, and the futility of war. But it also inspires resilience, the ability of nations and individuals to rise after catastrophe, to rebuild and redefine themselves. The same spirit that once built Yamato into a weapon of war later built Japan into a nation of peace and progress. The ship's memory, once associated with destruction, became intertwined with the idea of transformation. For historians, Yamato represents a paradox. She was both a masterpiece of engineering and a monument to failure. Her construction displayed the height of human ingenuity. Her destruction revealed the limits of that ingenuity when guided by flawed vision. The paradox remains timeless. Human beings are capable of extraordinary creation, yet often use that ability for self-destruction. In this way, Yamato is not merely a relic of Japanese history but a universal symbol of the human condition, a reflection of how greatness and tragedy often coexist, even now 80 years after her sinking. Divers and researchers continue to explore the Yamato wreck, each artifact retrieved from the seabed, each helmet, piece of armor, or personal belonging, tells a story. These remnants are not trophies but testaments, reminders of lives lost and lessons learned. They lie in silence, untouched by time, speaking a truth that outlives generations, that no power built on arrogance can endure, and no loss born of courage is ever meaningless if remembered. The legacy of the Yamato also lives on in how nations approach power in the modern world. Military strength remains necessary, yet the lesson of the battleship's demise urges caution against overconfidence. The true measure of national greatness lies not in weapons, but in wisdom, empathy, and restraint. Yamato teaches that the pursuit of peace requires as much courage as the pursuit of war, and that the mightiest victories are those that prevent battles, not those that win them. In many ways, the story of Yamato is a mirror for our age. As new technologies emerge, cyber weapons, artificial intelligence, autonomous drones, the temptation to believe in invincible systems returns again and again. But every generation must remember that there is no such thing as an unsinkable ship, no unbreakable wall, no undefeatable force. The ocean of history is littered with the wrecks of civilizations that believed otherwise. The lesson of Yamato endures precisely because it speaks not only to the past but to the future. Today, Yamato is no longer a weapon of war but a silent teacher. She lies in eternal rest beneath the sea, her great hull slowly embraced by coral and sediment, her guns stilled forever. Yet her story continues to resonate across time, not as a monument to destruction but as a plea for understanding. Every ripple above her grave carries the whisper of her lesson that pride must yield to humility, that technology must serve humanity, and that the true strength of a nation lies not in the size of its weapons, but in the depth of its wisdom. The Yamato's legacy, then, is not one of defeat but of enlightenment. It challenges us to look beyond the surface of war and see the patterns that lead to tragedy, to recognize the fragile balance between power and responsibility. Her fall reminds us that progress without perspective is perilous, and ambition without morality is ruinous. In the end, the Yamato teaches what all great tragedies teach, that even in destruction there can be meaning, and from the depths of failure, humanity can rise wiser, gentler, and stronger than before.